you everyone for coming to today's webinar. Hopefully you're in the right place. We're going to discuss the Research's Inquiry Framework in Distance Education courses. This webinar is sponsored by the ACRL Distance Learning Section Discussion Group, and I'm Tina Adams. I'm the co-chair of the Discussion Group Committee. For those of you who don't know much about our committee, the DLS Discussion Group selects topics and leads virtual discussions related to distance learning. So today we're one of the sessions that we often do throughout the year, but we also have two standing virtual discussions that we do. One follows the ALA Annual Conference and one follows the ALA Midwinter Conference. So be on lookout for those two sessions coming up. The format of today's sessions will be that we have two speakers, and each speaker is going to present on their implementation of the Research's Inquiry Framework in the distance education environment. The speakers will discuss how they did what they did and how they assess the effectiveness of their application. That will take the first 20 minutes. They'll each have 10 minutes to present. And then we're going to follow up with question and answer session and discussion. So I encourage you to ask questions. We'll have questions and answer at the end, but if you want to input a question in the chat box as we're going along so you don't forget, or if you have a pressing question, you can put it in the chat box, and my co-chair, Jill, is here, and she's going to gather questions. So if something needs to be addressed immediately, she will let us know. Otherwise, she will collect the questions for the end, and we'll discuss them in the question and answer segment of the session. Again, the session will be recorded and shared with all registrants via email, and we're going to post it to the DLS website. And at the end of this session today, we have a link on the last slide of the presentation that takes you to our evaluation form. So if you could please fill that out, that would be really helpful to us in planning future sessions and making sure that our topics are relevant and that we're doing what we should be doing for the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Presenting first will be Rebecca Ranieri. Rebecca is a distance librarian with Global Campus Library Services at Central Michigan University. Her primary responsibilities include library instruction and reference work with the remote and online students of CUM's Global Campus, using the flipped classroom approach to engage post-traditional students in active information literacy learning. In addition to her work with DLS, she serves on various CMU committees and is an original member of the Prezi Educator Society. Rebecca is on the editorial board for the Journal of Library and Information Services and Distance Learning, has served as a peer reviewer for the International Journal of Technology, Knowledge, and Society, and is an editor of the DLS conference proceedings. And our second presenter I will introduce later when it's her turn. But we do have Smita, let me make sure I said the name right, Smita Avesti. I think I got it right. And I will introduce you later, Smita, but the short of it is that she's the lead instruction librarian at Santa Rosa Junior College. So Rebecca, if you want to start us off, I'm going to go ahead and give you presenter privileges. And then when you're finished, you can go ahead and hand it off to Smita. Thank you.
Okay, Tina, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to be sure that my mic is good to go. Started today. Well, thank you for the introduction, Tina. Oh, there we are. So I'm going to be talking today about using Prezi to teach the Research as Inquiry Frame. And as Tina said, I'm Rebecca Ranieri. I'm from Central Michigan University's Global Campus Library Services. A little louder, okay. I'll make sure to speak more clearly into my mic here. So as Tina mentioned, I'm a member of the Prezi Educator Society, and what that basically means is that I'm a big fan of Prezi, and I look for any ways that I can to use Prezi as a tool in my library instruction, in my reference work, wherever I can find a good use for that. So just to give you a little bit of background about why I've made a pre-post test with the ACRL framework. As a pilot project, I created a pre-class activity I created in Prezi. It was not based on the framework, but I wanted to use the activity to flip the classroom. So I tried it out with 6 online classes and 3 remote classes from March to September of this year. So again, I wanted to flip the classroom by having the students learn about some of the harder threshold concepts of information literacy, and then get into really the discussion and the live demonstrations in class. So overall, the majority of students who attended my instruction sessions had completed the activity. Most of them had just answered the questions on their own and then came to the class with the answers, which was fantastic. I had at least one go-getter in every class that actually went into the Prezi itself to add questions there. I was accepted to speak about my use of Prezi to teach information literacy by the Michigan Library Association at their Technology and Trends workshop. And I wanted to expand on the work I'd done a little bit, even though I just done the pilot project with a pre-class activity, because Prezi has potential to be used for both pre-class activities and pre-post tests, which are a related concept. Sometimes people use one or both, or a hybrid concept of both of them to flip the classroom. So for this workshop, I created 4 templates in Prezi, and one of them was a pre-post test based on the ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education. So I called it template 3 because it was my 3rd template there, and it is based on the framework. And I designed the questions around the work of Staley, Branch, and Hewitt. I don't have a link to their paper here, but I have it in the Prezi itself, which is linked there below. They linked pre-post test questions for library instruction to the standards. They also linked them back to the instructor's learning outcomes for the session. They linked it back to standards set by the American Psychological Association. It was a really great work where they designed their test questions to reflect these different learning outcomes and standards. Excuse me. So this is it's just a screenshot of what the Prezi looked like. This is template 3. And again, you know, I don't have the time to really go through all of this, but I just want to point out that Prezi's slides are helpfully called frames. So I've got 6 Prezi frames, and each frame has a question that reflects one of the ACRL frames. And I'm just going to show you a couple of them just so you can get an idea of what the frames look like. So this is my authority is constructed and contextual frame. So my question is, your professor reported her research results in several outlets. Which source is the most reliable? Here's another one, my information has value frame. By the way, information has value is my favorite frame, even though I'm talking about research as inquiry today. This one I don't know, I like it the best. You may find that an article's PDF has a download fee when found on Google, but does not when found in library databases. Why? So some of the things you may be seeing about this is that, well, first of all, I have the name of the frame as the title of the slide, the Prezi frame. If you were actually giving this to a student, you probably wouldn't do that. You would, you know, make it more relevant to the student's work. And I've got multiple choice questions here, as well as space for students to add their own content. So it's meant to be a flexible template that you can adjust however you need it to. If you want to give your students multiple choice questions, you can do that. If you'd rather have them do short answer, you can do that too. Or you can have them do both. You know, it's really up to you. That's one of the great strengths of Prezi. So as librarians, we tend to want to give our students absolutely everything, right? We try to cram every information literacy concept possible into a 45-minute one-shot. But that can overwhelm people. So I created a new pre-post test using just the research as inquiry frame. And again, there's a link to it there. I believe you're going to be getting these slides, but if not, you can contact me afterwards and I can give you the links here. Both of these Prezis, my template and this one I'm going to show you, are public and reusable. So if you are a Prezi user, you can copy them, you can adjust and edit however you would like to. So again, I don't want to go through every one of these frames just in the interest of time, but I'll just point out this is a screenshot of the Prezi and what it looks like. And again, if you were actually using this as a pre-post test for your students, you wouldn't call it research as inquiry, probably. I guess you might. It'd probably be called something like, you know, English 101 library activity or something similar. And that's what it says if you follow the little arrow to the little frame there. It's telling you that you probably want to rename this. You also will probably want to get rid of the bullet points below it because those are just there to help explain why this template might be useful to you. Again, I've got 6 Prezi frames in this pre and post test, but this time each of the frames has a question related to the research as inquiry frame. So it relates back to either a knowledge practice or a disposition for learners. I'm going to go through them real quickly just to show you what the questions are. And again, it's a template, so you could adjust this based on your own learning outcomes, specific tasks you want your students to be able to accomplish. So my first one is research planning. You know, what's an effective strategy to plan your research of the literature? And I should say that I chose the research as inquiry frame because students tend to neglect this area, the research planning. They come up with a topic and then they jump right into searching to find information about it, and they don't really plan out their process as much as they could. And librarians often assume either that students have done this already or that the instructor has covered that part of it, and then they just jump into teaching the databases. Click here, here's how you do a search. So I thought that the threshold concepts around research as inquiry would be helpful for the students to understand as a pre-test before we got into the actual session. So here's my research planning question. What's an effective strategy to plan your research of the literature? Finding related articles. You found a really relevant article on your topic. What's the most efficient way to find more like it? Organizing your data. What is an annotative bibliography? Different points of view. What should you do if you find several articles whose findings are the opposite of yours? So again, these questions are being drawn from the research as inquiry, knowledge practices, the dispositions of learners, and it's very flexible. You could have multiple choice questions. You could have short answer questions. It's up to what you and your instructor that you're working with need. Gaps and weaknesses. It's important to note the limitations of the research that is available, true or false. And then finally, because one of the dispositions for learners is to seek appropriate help when needed, if you have problems finding the data you need, who is specifically trained to help you do so? Notice I didn't frame the question as who should you ask, because learners are going to ask whoever they want to ask. Who is trained to help you? Your advisor, your librarian, your friends, Google. So here's a brief sort of SWOT analysis of using a Prezi activity, whether that's a pre-class activity or pre-post test, in your instruction. Some of the strengths. It's a flexible and customizable format. So we've seen that. You can change it up to be whatever that you and your instructor need to have from the activity or from the test. You can easily link it into online class materials. So of the classes that I piloted this with, again, 6 of them were online classes. So I can I'm right in the LMS. I can drop the link right into the rest of the library materials. Some of the weaknesses that I noticed when I was doing the pilot, students may not be required to do the activity. And if they're not, they may not feel they have time for it, or they may not have any ambition to do it. So if the students don't complete the activity, it sort of, you have to readjust what you're going to be doing during the session. Another weakness is that students may be unfamiliar with Prezi. That was the biggest weakness that I noticed during the pilot. I was afraid it was going to be the first one, but actually I found that my students surpassed my expectations. They actually went ahead and did the activity. They really wanted to learn how to do this stuff. But I did run into some problems with students not signing up with Prezi, not getting the Prezi to work. So that's something to consider. Some opportunities, though, students could work collaboratively. One of the strengths of Prezi is that you can have multiple users working on the same Prezi at the same time. So if you had a little bit more time with the students, perhaps if you were an embedded librarian, you could have students work on this activity or this test in groups. Another opportunity is that it can be co-opted for in-class credit. I had several instructors offer bonus points for completing it, which was nice. Some of the threats, students, again, have limited time. These are busy people. And again, if there's no grade, or even if it's only like a few extra credit points, they may decide it's just not worth their time to do. But the biggest threat, I think, is that instructors may be unwilling to help or may just want more traditional instructional methods. So you might not get the instructor buy-in, which really helps with student activity in the pre-post test. Or you may get an instructor say, well, I want you to just come to my class and do a presentation, or I just want you to put a PowerPoint in there. With that said, you can still use the framework to help design your topics, to help design your questions, to help students understand the whys of their research, even if you don't happen to use a pre-test or post-test. That is all I have, and I think I'm right at 10 minutes, so I am going to put this over to, oh, there's my timer. I'm going to throw this right over to Tina again, so that she can introduce Smitha.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Smitha, and then we will do the questions at the end. I hope you all think of questions that you can add to the chat box as well. So Smitha Avasti, hopefully I said your name correctly. She's currently the lead instruction librarian at Santa Rosa Junior College. She's worked in academic libraries for 8 years and was a writing instructor before she became a librarian. This is her 6th year teaching a 1-credit online library class. She has an MLIS from the University of Washington, a PhD and an MA from the University of Oregon, and a BA from Lewis and Clark College. Thank you, Smitha. I'm going to go ahead and make you a presenter now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Little louder if possible.
A little louder? Okay. How about now? Is this better? Can
Yes,
everybody
thank
hear me?
you. Yes.
Okay, great. And should I just advance to get to the next slide?
Yes, just use the arrows. Yeah.
There we go.
Mhm.
Okay, great. So thank you. Thanks everybody for coming today. My name is Smitha, and I'm going to talk a little bit about an assignment that I crafted for my online class. I teach a one-unit library class every semester, and it's 100% online, so you really never get to see your students. Fortunately, some of them drop by. And I wanted to rework my class thinking about some of the framework concepts and trying to sort of reestablish the way that we thought about how students define their topics. And so I thought of it as the pursuit of a line of inquiry rather than as, choosing a topic or broadening a question. So my idea was that I was hoping to recast how we describe research to students because they tend to think of it as just being a set of steps that they have to take, like, they have to find 2 sources. One has to be a book. So they just find those and they don't really know how to use those tools. And I was thinking there has to be a better way for them to understand the research process. So I wanted them to see that we treat research as an exploration rather than as a set of sequential steps. And I also wanted to use really active terms, this idea of pursuit. So it's not that you just sort of come up with a question out of the blue and then somehow you write your paper, but that there's some activity involved and sort of this active pursuit. And I wanted to focus on the action, the pursuit, rather than the end product. So the exploration is just as important as what they actually produce. And last, I was hoping to describe that engagement is actually the underlying feature of effective research, that you really have to be interested in your topic and to indulge your curiosity for research to be effective. So to start this, I sort of set the stage with my students because I'm sure they weren't expecting this kind of question. And I started with some course reading that I actually called Welcome to the Scholarly Conversation because I wanted to introduce them to the idea that scholarship is an ongoing conversation and that they're expected to partake in it. And how do they take part in it? I don't think students are really aware of how to do that, what the expectations might be. I think they know they have to write an essay, but they get really confused about what sort of conventions we generally find in a scholarly essay, which is why sometimes you get some topics that are extremely limited in their scope. And I think this might be especially true for my student population. I work with community college students, many of which they're the first in their family to come to college. And they don't really have any models. They haven't seen anybody engage in this kind of research ever. So that's kind of how I introduced it. And then I presented the assignment as an invitation. I invited them to pursue one of their passions and to indulge their curiosity. I wanted them to treat research as just a lifelong activity. It wasn't tied to a paper or a class or anything if they didn't want it to be. And I also then described to them my experiences of working, pursuing lines of inquiry. So I talked to them about how I wrote, because it's a distance class, so I wrote to them about how my own experience actually inspired the assignment when I was listening to a podcast, and I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. I'd like to know more about this. And so I looked up a few articles and I read a little bit more about it, and it wasn't necessarily this intense research experience, but it was something that I just kind of pursued my curiosity, and I saw where it took me. And then I also created a sample of my assignment so that they could see what it would look like when they were finished. And it gives them a sense of the expectations, but it also shows them that I'm engaging in the same kind of thing. I referred to an article I'd read out of the New York Times where they'd found that a lot of peer-reviewed literature in the social sciences was kind of problematic. And so I wrote about that and about why that was interesting to me and why I thought it was an important part of my field and the academic conversation. So then I wrote the prompt, which is basically the same thing in 3 different ways. The first option is to listen to a podcast, and the second is to read some articles from a magazine. And then I did give them the option to combine it with a research paper they might be writing for another class. And so other than that, it's pretty much the prompt is exactly the same in that, it'll say, you listen to an episode pay attention to new ideas, new information, jot down concepts. So it's just giving them some basics on how they should read kind of actively. And I chose this for a couple of reasons. I liked the podcast. I think it appeals to audio learners, which sometimes get a little short shift in distance classes because we always have problems with captioning. And so I thought, well, you know, I'll have an option for audio learners, but then I also did need an alternative for hearing impaired students because a lot of podcasts are not closed captioned. So that's why I made, you know, a separate option that was entire, no points would be deducted in any way kind of option, but they could also just look at a magazine or newspaper articles. And I wanted to guide them to a different kind of reading material because some of my students, like I said, they haven't really experienced this, this kind of research activity where you're just kind of pursuing something for pleasure. And so I gave them some lists of sources that they could use, and I listed a couple of podcasts and then some magazines or newspapers that are easily accessible either online or in print. And so that way students wouldn't really be at a disadvantage if they had some problems with the podcasts. And it also helped direct them to sources that would probably give them enough information to get started. The third one, which is having the class, is one that I always would offer. I think that that really appeals to people who want something very practical. They want to apply their skills right away. And if they're sort of unfamiliar with technology, they're afraid of podcasts, they would have some options. And then the students created their own option, which I wasn't expecting. I had at least a few of them just start talking about a book that they had read that they thought was really interesting and they wanted to go further with it, and that was their topic. And I kind of liked that they had done that because it showed me that they were, as I would put it, they were geeking out on the topic, you know, just letting their curiosity kind of drive their interests. And also, very interestingly to me, none of them chose the option about working with another paper for another class. Nobody chose that option at all. And then I gave them some details as to why, you know, talk about the project, I mean, the topic, why did it interest you? How is it related to your past experience? And then I also wanted to make sure that they set the topic in an analytical context, because frequently I would get students who would be just writing about their own experience. They would bring in anecdotal evidence from other sources. It would be really hard for them to contextualize it in terms of the scholarly conversation. So I wanted them to also explain why it was relevant to the scholarly conversation, or what department or discipline it would be suitable for this particular topic if they wanted to pursue it. And then I designed the rubric for grading it, because I used sort of a different approach than I might have used when I had just asked them to write a research question and I wanted them to broaden the topic or narrow the topic. And, you know, we had those sort of sequential steps. So instead I wanted to talk more about the things I was hoping that they would actually accomplish. So I graded on 2 criteria, and one was how they described the experience, and the other was how they explained that it had academic potential, or that it could be situated in the scholarly conversation. So the description piece was about whether or not they were very engaged and they were kind of thoughtful, and they, you know, they had actually thought about it, or they could certainly get passable scores if they were kind of perfunctory and were not really interested, but they had still chosen one. And then finally, if they just sort of chose something because they just wanted to get their homework done in 5 minutes. And similarly, I was just saying, does this demonstrate that it's applicable to an academic field? Do you have evidence for that, or do you not? So it wasn't a very complicated rubric, but it was one that helped me get at whether they were really treating research as inquiry, or whether they just sort of had missed the point of that exercise. And most of the students did very well on this. I found that they were very engaged in the topics that they had chosen, and they could all put them in the academic context. And they had expressed a level of interest that I hadn't seen before when I asked them to choose research topics, especially when they were writing about why it mattered to them. I saw that they were far more interested. I think there was only one student who seemed kind of, I'll just get this done, and never really had some engagement on that. And then last but not least, the final results I got were the that they have this extremely wide range of topics. I couldn't believe the kinds of topics that I actually found. I was so intrigued by them. And whenever I asked before, they were always just sort of these standard things that I would have never thought of. But I had students who wanted to work on the uses of human manure, which shocked me. I had students who wanted to talk about tiny houses. Somebody was really interested in Bitcoin, just things that I would not have expected. And we had a very rich discussion about it on the forum. When I asked them to share their topics, I often get students replying to each other just saying, oh, that topic's great, and then they're sort of done. But this time they were really engaged with each other. And I thought it also set the stage for the touchstones that we kept revisiting throughout the class, that you have to be curious and that you start off with a line that takes you somewhere and you're not expecting it. The next assignment I talked about testing the topic by using sources and pursuing answers. But more than anything, I was hoping to give them a glimpse of what it's like to nerd out on a topic, because I think that's part of a frame of mind or a disposition that we want our students to have. We want them to feel free to indulge their curiosity and to think really strongly about their topics, rather than just thinking that there are various requirements they have to check off a list in order to finish their research. And now I've just included some contact information for me in case you want to contact me about anything. And I understand that the presentation is going to be available online, but I just thought I'd leave my email address anyway. Thanks so much. Should I throw it back to you?
Yeah, you can go ahead and give the mic back to me. I think Jill's been collecting some questions for us, and we also had some questions ourselves. But thank you so much for the presentations. Jill, did you want to go ahead and have me give you control, and you can gather any questions from the chat?
Sure. So far, there is just one question, and that question comes from John Siegel, who asks, Smita, did you work with freshmen, sophomore, or upper-level students?
I worked with lower division undergraduates. As a community college, that's all we have. So some of them have been in school for a while, but they're certainly still at that freshman, sophomore level.
Okay, great. And then we have another question that came in for you from Jenny Yap. And Jenny says she might have missed it, but how long did the activity you described take? Was this done over the semester, a week, or a few weeks?
So the activity, this particular activity took 1 week, in that they had a week to listen to the podcasts and to write the description of their exploration of a topic. But then after that, they used that same topic throughout the entire term, so that then when we would talk about search techniques, they would search by using that topic, and we would talk about evaluation of sources. They would evaluate the sources they'd found on that topic, and their final project was on that topic. So that was how they ended up working through so they ended up keeping their topic. I think there's one student who wanted to change halfway through, but that was another thing that I noticed, that nobody really asked to change topics, which had happened before.
Okay, great. And we do have some questions coming in for both of you, both presenters, but let me just follow up with this one other question that's specifically for Smita. Did you cover the other frames as well, or have you only had time to cover the one frame in your class?
So no, I covered other frames as well. And this, as you could probably see from the beginning, I started off with scholarship as a conversation. I used that as kind of a theme throughout the whole class. And then I was using research as inquiry, and I also spent some time on the authority as constructed and contextual, as well as information has value. But I think I'm still working out the best course material for searching is strategic and format is process. So not all of them, but some of them.
Great, okay. Now a question for both of you from Terry Summy. How did you both, or how are you assessing the projects? And if we could start with Rebecca.
In terms of assessment, so far I've just sort of been collecting the pilot project's data. you know, I don't have my numbers with me, but overall I did have a great number of participation in the project, which is a good thing. One of my slides, and I didn't really read it off, it had some more information. So this September, I actually started a more formal project with 2 other librarians, one from Loyola Chicago and one from Colorado College, where we did 2 classes, one with the activity and one without, for the same, different sections of the same course. And we actually have the citations from the students in hand, and we're going to be doing a full citation analysis to see what impact, if any, there was in having the students do the pre-activity and learning those threshold concepts first. But that's still under research, so look for that hopefully soon next year.
And then, Smita, did you want to respond to that as well?
Oh, sure. So for this particular project, I had an actual assignment, and so I had a rubric. I used that to assess that particular, you know, how they did on that assignment. And I'm kind of I'm debating whether or not I want to do a compare and contrast with what I'd done previously, with the grades as to whether or not they were passing or what their scores were. But the assignments are so different that it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. I did find that I would say at least my guess is 90% of the students who turned in something got very high scores, because I was really pleased with everything they turned in. So that's primarily how I was assessing it.
Okay, thank you. The next question, and I believe this is for Smita, was your course graded or pass, no pass? And also, is it a required course or an elective?
So that's a great question. It's a little confusing. The course is graded or no pass, or pass, no pass. It depends on the student. They can take either option. I've only had one student who takes the pass-fail option. And the class is it required or elective is a wonderful question. I think it depends on what degree they're actually going to be pursuing. If they're pursuing one of what we just call an AA degree here, if it's a regular AA degree, then yes, it's a required course. If they decide to do a transfer degree, then it's not required, it's an elective course.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is for Rebecca. This comes from Matt Bernstein, who asks, how were you distributing results of the Prezi quizzes to students, and where and how was the actual content presented to the students?
Great question. So the content was actually in a Prezi presentation, which is Prezi, and I should have mentioned this before, is a cloud-based software. So you can link to specific presentations. So I provided the link and asked the students to go to the activity and to answer the questions there. They also had the option, again, I know students have limited time, to sign up for Prezi and answer the questions actually within the Prezi, and I did have a few students do that. In terms of the results, so when we actually got to the library instruction session, that's what we started with those questions, and we talked about our answers. And I spent a little bit more time on the ones that students tended to get wrong. And I found that it made for a really engaged online class. For those of you who do online instruction sessions, sometimes it can seem like you're just sitting there talking to a wall, and you have no idea if the students are on the other end or if they got up and went to go have dinner or what. So by asking them questions and having them respond and talk about those answers, it provided a really great discussion as a foundation for that instruction session. So I hope that answers your question. So we distributed the results, so to speak, by talking about them during the session before we went on to doing the live demonstrations of the databases.
Okay. The next question is from Eugene Rosen, who asks, how long was the course? Was it a full semester? And I assume that's for Smita. I think, Rebecca, your class was just a single class or part of a class?
Yes, this was not an information literacy course per se. These were classes that I was visiting for education and business graduate students.
Okay, thanks. And then Smita, was your class a full semester?
So no, the information literacy class that we have is offered in the online format, either in 6 weeks or 9 weeks, and we have an 18-week semester. So it was my class is a 9-week semester, or a 9-week class, so it's half the semester.
And I'll just jump in a second here, Jill. I think we skipped one question from John Siegel, I think it was for Smita. He asked, our freshmen struggle with the term academic. What are you defining as academic? Magazines, newspapers?
Oh, that's a great question. I think students tend to want to see things in very neat categories. So I think it's easy for them if we say there's scholarly peer-reviewed articles and then there's everything else. But I don't think that's really the way that most people conduct research. And so I wanted to kind of complicate what we mean by that term academic. So when is it an academic source and when is it not? And frequently I would talk to them about the context in which something would be considered an academic source. And that's partially why I like that part of the assignment where I would say, take this topic and put it in the academic context. How does it look different in that context versus, you know, just, is it academic or is it not? It's like, well, can you make it into an academic? How would an academic treat this topic? And how would it be different than if it wasn't in the academic context? So if you had something like a newspaper and it was just giving you just the bare facts on it, is that actually treating it in an academic way, or is it treating it in the way of a reporter? And so that question came up most often actually when we were talking about authority being constructed and contextual. This idea of what is a good source, what's an academic source, was whether or not it helps answer your question and whether it would be considered valuable in a scholarly conversation, and what do we use to define what is valuable. I found it to be a very complex sort of set of conversations that we had when we were talking about that. And I wouldn't say that all the students got everything that I was hoping they would, but I also noticed that they found that particular part of the class to be the most useful to them when I surveyed them at the end. They thought that I listed all 6 frames just to see which one kind of they felt was important to what they had learned, and the majority of them picked authority as constructed and contextual as being the one that they thought they were the most surprised by and the most, that they had learned the most from. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, great. We do have some more questions for Rebecca regarding Prezi. One comes from Susan Vega Garcia, and she asks, does Prezi collect anonymous responses or comments from students?
That is a great question, and the answer is yes and no. So to participate in a Prezi, you have to be an editor on that Prezi. So you have to contact someone and say, you know, I would like editing privileges for the Prezi, or you can just invite people to edit your Prezi. When you make a change on the Prezi, it doesn't record who did that change. So if I, say, had 4 co-editors, and one of them went in there and started answering some questions, I wouldn't know which of them answered the questions. But if I've only got one, and in many cases I only had one student be an editor on the Prezi with me, I got to assume it's them. So one of the things they can do that's more anonymous, I believe, is that they can comment on the Prezi, but you know, now that I'm thinking about it, that probably tags you. I don't know if you can anonymous comment on Prezi. I'd have to look into that. But for the most part, it is not anonymous. I generally have an idea of who's an editor, so I at least have some idea of who added content there.
Okay, and then the next question for you about Prezi, it's not ADA, this is from TAMU Libraries, it's not ADA compliant. Do you have or use some sort of an alternative to that?
That's an excellent point. Yes, I do use an alternative. Prezi is not ADA compliant, and it can have it can affect people with its zooming issues. And another problem that I have with Prezi is that it's still very much based on Flash, which is not the most secure of softwares. So for those students who reported back to me saying, you know, I can't read the activity, it's not loading for me, or if they had any other kind of problem, I had a PDF of those questions that I would then send to the student, and that I also made available on the library, the LMS for the course, so that they could just go to that document and not have to worry about the software.
And I had a related question, I think, from one of our committee members about Prezi. Basically, they were asking, what is the benefit of using Prezi over using a tool such as Google Forms, where the students could respond directly to the questions in the assessment tool, and you would have direct access to the responses? Do you see that there's any advantage to Prezi over Google Forms?
In terms of collecting the responses, no. I think probably Google Forms has the advantage there. Prezi, as a presentation tool, its strength is that it can link concepts together in a very visual way. So for those people who are very visual learners and get the connections between large threshold concepts, you could use Prezi as sort of a dynamic canvas to show in and out. Now what I presented here was very basic because it's, again, a template and you can customize it any way you like. But in terms of collecting the results, you know, it probably doesn't have that many advantages over Google.
Okay. And Tina, did you have additional questions?
Yes, I did. So I think that was all the questions in the chat for now. If anybody wants to add more, feel free. But there were a few other questions that we had. So another question that came up was for Smitha. Let's see. I really like the idea of portraying research as an exercise in curiosity. In your experience, has this assignment sparked the curiosity you were looking for?
I would say that for some students it really did. There were students who were extremely excited by this concept. They said that they'd been really revitalized by the idea that they were engaged in this conversation, and it was really interesting for them. I think for other students, it wasn't. Some of them, I think, chose topics that kind of died out a little bit. But like, for instance, one student chose a topic not really understanding that it was going to be the topic he'd be using for the rest of the class. And so about a week later, he said that he had found an article he had read that he thought was really interesting about karaoke and using it as a healing, like for building confidence and healing people. And I thought, well, but he was so excited by it. And he's like, can I talk about that instead? And I'm like, yeah, go ahead, talk about that instead. And he got very excited that he could just go anywhere that he wanted. So I think it did inspire some curiosity for them. But I think they also sort of treated the assignments towards the end, particularly, I think, as they just had to finish them. So I don't know if they could sustain that level of curiosity. I think it kind of started out as interesting, and then it didn't sort of pan out. But then there were some students, and I'd say that there's probably about, I'd say there's probably about 30% of them were like that, whereas it's more like 70% were extremely curious about the topic until the very end. So I think that was sort of it's sort of fun for me to see that.
Thank you. And I think Jill had a question come into chat.
Yeah, so Smita, we have a question from Lugene. Did the podcasts have a direct link to the students' geeking out topic, or were they just used as a representative sample of a different format for information? And I wasn't sure. I kind of got the impression that they were two separate options, right? The podcasts were one option, and the other option, or you had mentioned the geeking out as being kind of a just them choosing a topic they were really excited about.
Yes. Well, the podcasts were one option, and the other option were to just find newspapers or magazines. But I found that if you tell students that, they actually don't know what they don't know what's out there. So I gave them a pre-selected list of podcasts and a pre-selected list of magazines and newspapers. So the articles would be fairly accessible. I didn't want, they're freshmen and sophomores, so I didn't want anything that would be very difficult for them to try to sort of launch their curiosity. And they wouldn't be necessarily too long, but I didn't want it to be something that would be so short that they would get stuck immediately because it didn't have any meat to it. So that's why I kind of chose things like from the Atlantic or the New York Times, and then podcasts like Invisibilia, rather than some comedy podcast they might find, or an entertainment podcast that might not help them as much. And then the geeking out part was, I was hoping that would happen regardless of whatever they chose, because that's more that, and I'm sure it's not one of the knowledge dispositions because it's called geeking out, but that's in my mind, when the knowledge disposition under treating research as inquiry is that they're just sort of geeking out on a topic. And the students who chose the books that they had read, because they were just excited by something they had read previously, that was when I sort of thought, well, just let them go with it. At first I was thinking they should follow the parameters of the assignment and how am I going to use this rubric, and then I just thought, no, this is exactly what you want them to do. It's just to find a topic that they're interested in and just to geek out on it, and if they've already been geeking out on it, that's great too. So that was sort of the term that I have used when describing it on the message boards to them, and it was hopefully all of them engaged in that process.
And I had kind of a related question from our committee that we developed some questions, and this one occurred to me because it happens a lot when I do instruction, and Rebecca or Smita, either one you can answer. Maybe the research as inquiry would be helpful for getting students, encouraging students to follow the research where it leads, because I have seen that many students come in with a preconceived notion about what they want to find, and then they're trying to find the evidence to back that up, as it were, instead of coming with an open mind and seeing where the research leads. Did either of you find that this approach helped students come to the question with more of an open mind?
I would think that it did. I found also, I think part of what happens is when we would choose topics previously, it was usually described in terms of making an argument. And so it was really that, again, exactly that process you were talking about. They knew what they wanted to say, they'd already made up their mind, and now they just wanted to find evidence to back it up. And that's so antithetical to what actually happens when you're trying to do research that it's a little bit discouraging to see that attitude. So that was why they didn't sort of have an end product in mind. It was just create a list of sources. You don't have to have a conclusion. You don't have to know what you think about it yet. Just go in and chase something down and see what you uncover. So I think that that was very effective in that way. I didn't get as many students just saying, well, I need to find a source to support my argument, because they didn't really have that thesis already in their head. They just had a topic in their head.
Okay, and we have a question for both of you. How many students were in each of your classes? So if we could start with Rebecca.
The average number of students that were in my classes was between 20 and 25. Now, in terms of completing the activity, I would say I had about a 75% rate, just based on how engaged the students were. The one more formal study where I actually collected the responses, that it reflected that as well. So where I had 23 students, I got 15 students to send me answers to those questions before the session.
And I had about 20 students after we got, it was sort of chaotic those first few weeks where people were not actually showing up. So I think it was about 20, and then I would say that probably about 5 didn't finish the class. So that's always a little depressing.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Lydia Pyburn. Are there other ways either one of you that are thinking about to make the instruction more interactive? And if we could maybe start with Smita this time.
Oh, okay. Well, the way I thought about making the instruction more interactive is primarily through the work that they're doing on discussion boards, in that I want to make sure that they're sharing with each other, that there's student-to-student interaction as well as student-to-teacher interaction. I've thought about having something similar to this, actually, where we would have something in synchronous time where we could all sort of talk to each other online, but it's so hard to coordinate with their schedules that it hasn't really been possible. One thing that I try to do in terms of making their work interactive is to give them a springboard and to let them do hopefully most of the work. I think one thing that is really difficult is to know when they need to figure it out for themselves and when we should just show them how to do it. So I'm kind of like, well, I'm going to give them sort of some guidelines and then just let them jump in themselves. So that way they can interact with the research on their own. But I think in the distance class, it's always a little bit more difficult. So that's why I always have the message boards set up where they do have to respond to each other as well. And I tend to stay very quiet during those discussions because I find that when I respond to a message, nobody else responds to that thread ever again. So then at the end, I always give them a summary of what I thought about what they'd said. But I found them to be very engaged with each other. They seem to really like those discussion boards. And then, of course, there's the interaction I have with them when I talk to them about their topics.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is Rebecca. You know, Prezi is one tool of many. It's just the one I happen to use for this. But I think whatever tool that you happen to use, flipping the classroom is the way to make the instruction more interactive. You know, if you can get the students to start thinking about these concepts before they even show up to your class, you can use that as a jumping off point to start the discussion. And even in online classes, you can make it more interactive and more engaging. You know, especially you can even have the students themselves take over the discussion. You know, let's talk about what we learned. Let's have you guys go first, that sort of thing. So, you know, again, whether you choose to do an activity or pre-post tests, whether you use Prezi, whether you don't, I think if you have that information available for the students to work on before they even come to your instruction session. And again, I'm basing mine on the one-shot model where I'm visiting an established class. This is not an information literacy class where I'm the instructor. So, you know, Smitha has a different situation than me, but I think the active learning really helps get the students engaged.
Thank you both. Tina, did you have any additional questions?
There was a couple more. So one of them was kind of a more general question about research as inquiry framework. It seems that research as inquiry is a great threshold concept for introducing the research process to students, especially freshmen. Do either of you incorporate Google or web searching in your lessons?
This is Rebecca again. I usually work mostly with graduate students, so I'll just put that out there. Post-traditional students, so working adults who've been out of school for a while and are just now coming back. But I do find that a lot of students prefer to use Google or Google Scholar in their research, and so I do incorporate that, especially as, you know, you can link Google Scholar back to your library's SFX or 360 linking system. So, you know, I sort of pull them in that way. But we do discuss web searching and web resources and ways to, you know, going back to sort of the authority is constructed in contextual frame. We discuss those topics as well.
I would say the same. Students they always want to use Google. Some of them are using Google Scholar, some of them are not. And I found that question came up most often when I was discussing search, the ability to search, and the questions of authority, particularly when students would find websites. And so that's when I think we spent more time on it. But I also do have some questions that are related to Google's advanced search to sort of see how they parallel or how they differ from search options from the search engines that we use. And so it's kind of it's just a way for them to think a little bit more about how they have to search these tools, how they have to use these tools differently, and how what they're going to find is going to be a little bit different. But I would say it's definitely not the main point of the class is to talk about web searching.
Thank you. And I think there was one last question that was kind of related to the other frame, authority is constructed and contextualized. So someone asked, you mentioned providing a sample. I think this was you, Smitha, in your class. You mentioned providing a sample answer, which you refer to again when discussing source evaluation. Do you apply the authority as constructed framework when you discuss source evaluation?
So yes, this time I did, definitely. It was one of the ways that I talked about it, and it was a little bit interesting because I combined that concept with some of the methods I'd used before. So we were talking about other things like, you know, relevance and objectivity, you know, the kind of standard criteria that we've always discussed. But the students seemed most interested in that question of authority. They certainly came back to it over and over again, and to the point that I got concerned that they weren't paying attention to the other criteria that we might want to use. I would write the sample. I do a sample for every assignment that I ask the students to do, unless it's like a multiple choice quiz or something like that, where doing a sample kind of gives it all away. And it's in some ways so that they can see what's expected of them, because I think sometimes the open-ended question is really confusing for students. They don't know exactly what they're supposed to do. So it gives them some idea of what they need to do to get the points that they want. But also, because I found that when I do the sample, I sometimes will realize how badly worded my question is. I'm actually trying to answer it, and I think, that doesn't actually describe it. And then I'll go back and revise the question. So it turns out to be a really good way for me to test the assignment before I bring it on to my students. So I just usually pick, like I'll pick a topic and then describe that one. So for the authority is constructed and contextual sample, I actually have them write about the sources that they'd found. And this time I did something sort of unusual when it came to the sample that I provided. I created a library guide for a topic, kind of a sort of pressing topic at our institution. And I ended up talking to them about how I'd chosen the sources for that topic, how I decided which ones were going to be considered appropriate, why did I choose this source and I did not choose that source. So I just wrote up a little short example of that. And then I also had I have this little fake bibliography that I write using imagined sources. Everything's always set in Harry Potter land in my world. And so, it's these sources written by those characters. So that way it can't be reused or plagiarized in any way. And so I wrote a sample of that, the entry that I would want as well. So like, this is why I like this source. This is why I would discard this source.
We do have one last question that came in. I think we do have time for this final question. For both panelists, how long did it take you to develop your course or your curriculum, and how many other people, if any, were involved? And before you go ahead and answer that, I just want to note that I'm going to paste the link to the evaluation form in the chat box. But if you would go ahead and respond, Rebecca, to that question.
Certainly. So it's sort of an iterative process, because I think one of the big things about the framework is that people have the idea that this is new and different, but it's really just a different way of looking at things we've already been doing. So I decided that one of my goals for this calendar year was to make my instruction more active, flip the classroom a little bit, make it more engaging. And so I spent a few months just thinking about what I wanted to do, coming up with the questions I wanted to ask, how I wanted to go about it. I was mostly involved, although I did take a lot of input from my other colleagues at Global Campus Library Services. There are 6 of us total, so one of which is my director. So, I got some feedback from them, and I just and again, it's a pilot project. So as I went through it and started using this activity with different classes, I went back and adjusted based on things I was hearing.
I think you had a much neater answer than mine. I would say probably the same thing in many ways. I agree that the framework is really just recasting things that we've already talked about. So in some ways I was reusing material I'd already created, in some ways I was revising it, and sometimes I was inventing it. So that's why it's a little bit harder to say how much time it took. But it was really something that I was just doing on my own. I was just kind of experimenting with it as seeing how it looks in this particular class. And I'm going to be talking to the librarians that I work with about the experiments that I've done with this class, trying to recast it by using the framework. A couple of other librarians here have done the same thing, and so they're going to be sharing that work as well. But we all sort of did it independently. So I'm curious to see what they came up with. I wish I could give you a better sense of how long it took, but unfortunately, I wasn't really keeping track of how long it was taking me to write up the course material. So, but normally I would say it takes about, to create an online learning module, for me it takes probably about 4 hours, so 4 or 5, depending.
Okay, thank you both. And Tina, did you have any closing comments?
I'm sorry, I forgot the evaluation link. You'll see on the next slide, it says evaluation link here, but it's not there. So please do see the chat box to fill out the evaluation for us. Thank you, Jill, for providing that. And I'd like to thank our two presenters. Thank you guys so much. This is really very interesting topic. I think it helps to see how people are actually using the frameworks, especially in distance ed. When we read the frameworks, it's not always so obvious how to translate that into the online environment. So this helped me a great deal. Again, we will be sending out recording of the session to all the participants, and we will post it to the DLS website. And I think that's about it, unless anybody else has anything to add as closing remarks. I hear no closing remarks, so I guess we're all good. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.